Greetings, students. So today, let's review photosynthesis. Remember, the entire purpose of photosynthesis is to take energy from the sun and turn that energy into organic molecules. And what I mean by organic molecules, so those are molecules that contain carbon to hydrogen bonds. And we need these organic molecules because these can be energy for later. So in other words, we use these organic molecules as food. And of course, when you hear the word photosynthesis, the organic molecule you should think of right off the bat is going to be glucose. In photosynthesis, we use energy from the sun to make food, or in other words, glucose. Where does photosynthesis happen? This all happens inside the chloroplast. And remember, the chloroplast is an organelle which is inside of a eukaryotic cell. Eukaryotic cell. Here is the equation for photosynthesis. You do need to have this memorized. So we have 6 water plus 6 CO2 plus light makes C6H12O6, which is glucose, plus 6 oxygen. Well, this overall equation is the sum of the 2 steps of photosynthesis. The first step are the light-dependent reactions. And the second step is the Calvin cycle. Let's look at these in more depth. The light-dependent reactions occur in the thylakoid, inside the chloroplast. They need, in other words, the input is light and water, and they make oxygen, ATP, and NADPH. Now I wrote these in a different color because the ATP and the NADPH, the reason we made these is because they're going to get used immediately in the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle, this occurs in the stroma of the chloroplast, which is like the cytoplasm of the chloroplast. It needs CO2 and this ATP and NADPH, which we made in the light-dependent reactions. So this comes from here. And what we make is glucose. We actually make a precursor to glucose, but for our purposes, it is good enough to know that this is where the glucose comes from. It ultimately comes from the product of the Calvin cycle. Just like cellular respiration, photosynthesis is an example of a metabolic pathway, and that's because the products of the light reactions are the reactants of the Calvin cycle. So let's go through this again. First, we need water and light, and we use that water and light ultimately to create the intermediates, ATP and NADPH. As a byproduct, meaning something that's not going to go into the next step, we also, in this step, make oxygen. This first step, these are the light-dependent reactions. In the second step of photosynthesis, we're going to use up this ATP and NADPH, and we're going to add into that some carbon dioxide, and when we do that, we're going to make glucose. So this step, the second step, is the Calvin cycle. So the light-dependent reactions plus the Calvin cycle together makes photosynthesis. And that's why when we look at the overall equation for photosynthesis, we only see water, light, oxygen makes CO2 and glucose. And that's because, yes, we made some ATP and NADPH, but then we immediately used it up. So it's not in the overall reaction. So the most important thing to remember is that photosynthesis makes glucose. It makes food. And then the cell takes that glucose and uses it in respiration. Respiration is what actually makes the ATP for your cell. So this is why plants are able to do both photosynthesis and respiration, because they need the second part, the respiration, to make that ATP. Let's look at that again. Here are the equations for photosynthesis and respiration. In photosynthesis, we take light, water, and CO2 to make glucose and oxygen. And then in respiration, we take glucose and oxygen to make water, CO2, and ATP. Well, what would happen if we added these two equations together? Well, if we do that, we'll cross out anything that is both a reactant and a product. So for example, we've got 6 waters here and 6 waters here, so they'd cancel out. 6 CO2 here, 6 here, they cancel out. 6 oxygens, they cancel out. And then yes, even this glucose that we worked so hard to make in photosynthesis is going to cancel out because it's a reactant in respiration. So if we sum the two together, we'll see that photosynthesis plus respiration allows us to take light, or in other words, energy from the sun, and turn that into ATP. In other words, it's turning it into energy for our cells. And that's why this combination is so amazing, because it allows us to take this energy from out in the solar system and allows us to power all of the reactions inside of our body. It's pretty cool.